It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the remorseless Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How are you doing this afternoon, Robert?
I am doing great, Andy, in search of a more perfect union in today's topic.
I love the way you introduce each show. Like last week on Carl Sagan, you said you're ready to shoot for the stars. So
Yeah.
it's in search of a more perfect union. I love it. All right. Well, the founders of the U.S. Constitution, these guys, real heroes. And I just want to say from the outset,
Yes.
I'm just a dilettante in this area. I know you're very widely read in this. Most of what I know about comes from Joseph Ellis's great book, the Quartet, which I strongly recommend on the framing of the U.S. Constitution. So I'll defer to you on a lot of this material.
Thanks, Andy. But you do know a lot because, first of all, you study heroes, and in this book, though, what I'd like to do today is actually bring up more of John Jay, who's someone that's covered. He's covered in that book very well, and he's one of the lesser known founders. But how about if we just set the context first of what the U.S. was like?
Let's say one thing first. Three of the quartet we've already done hero shows on. We've covered George Washington. If I remember, we did 2 episodes on Washington, and you were the guest, on there to discuss Washington. Yes. I remember you also the guest with John Hersey and I to discuss Alexander Hamilton, and we did a show on James Madison. So three of the 4 members of the quartet we've already done hero shows on. Now in a slightly different context, and John Jay we have not. So yeah, it'd be good. It would be, and Jay is influential in this regard. So it'd be good to discuss his contributions as well as the other 3 giants that we're talking about.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So the context is the War for Independence is won, 1783, the Treaty of Paris. And then over the next several years, it's a mess. The states are not united. They are free and independent states, 13, as a Declaration of Independent States. But there's border disputes. There's currency disputes. Spain is blocking the port of New Orleans. There's no real military backing. There's still British troops in North America, and Hamilton, Washington, James Madison, and John Jay know that this is it's not sustainable, and some others as well. They aren't the only ones, but Andy, to the extent that this book is a big part of our discussion today, I think it's important to set the context that the articles were not really holding weight. The states had sovereignty. And if we take a step back and once again establish this is the era of the Enlightenment, okay? And winning the war is important. Winning the war for independence. First, writing the Declaration is a landmark, pivotal moment in history. Then winning the war is important. But what kind of country will we have? Will it be an agrarian, southern feudal, slave-based society? Will it be more of a northern industrial, pro-banking, pro-business society, or some kind of mixture of the two? And that's the context where
right. And that was the Hamilton Jefferson debate, right?
That was definitely part of that distinction. But it's interesting because Madison and Washington were Virginians, so they were in the South as well. But they still felt the need for a single central federal government. And most people consider themselves Virginians, or in the North, John Adams, etc., consider themselves New Englanders. But I'll bring right from the beginning, one of James Ellis's points is that this quartet, they all had a function in the war, okay, and in the war for independence. And part of that, by being in the war, you get to see the grander picture, because first of all, you're traveling to different parts of the United States geographically, and then you're seeing the weakness of nobody wants to pay for anything, and so with that being the context, Ellis sets the stage for these four to come on to the scene.
Right. And the Articles of Confederation, just like the name, is just a loose confederation of sovereign states. This is not a national. This is not a federation. This is a confederation. It's not a republic. It's just a loose bunch of states. And so it's first of all, they don't teach American history in the schools anymore. But even if they did, it's in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's hard for us to imagine. We grew up in the second half of the 20th century. It's hard for us to imagine that there might not be an American republic. There might just have been a bunch of states. It's just we take it for granted. But but I think Joseph Ellis is right when he calls this orchestrating the Second American Revolution, 1783 to 1789.
Yeah.
This is the second part of the American Revolution. First part to win the War of Independence. The second part to set up an American Republic. And certainly Hamilton had that vision. Washington had that vision. On a continental scale, not just a bunch of sovereign, little sovereign states. So to have a national Republican continental vision. And this was unpopular. This was, we should point out, this was, Joseph Ellis points out it was unpopular, and we can understand why. Patrick Henry, gave it when we get to the Virginia ratification debate, he gave an eloquent speech, as he always did, against the Constitution, because a lot of Americans thought it defied what they called the spirit of '76. That we had fought this huge power, was far away. And this is the 18th century. It's not like you have modern transportation and communication. The far away, how our objections to Parliament, that they didn't care about the American colonists across the ocean, could just as well apply to a federal government in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, wherever it would be. Because how could they know what the farmers in Georgia? Why would they know or care what the farmers in Georgia wanted, or pioneers pushing through the Cumberland Gap? It was there was a healthy distrust of a powerful centralized federal government in the American spirit of the 18th century that the quartet had to overcome, and their supporters had to overcome and assure that the rights of American citizens would not be violated by a remote, uncaring, distant federal regime. And the Bill of Rights, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights, came about to assuage those kind of fears.
That's right. That's right. And so what you mentioned were the anti-federalists. Patrick Henry was one of them. And the way I think of this, Andy, it's almost like I think of a Victor Hugo novel where the villains are giants. Okay, they're giants just as the heroes are. And in this case, if we look at what I don't consider anti-federalist villains, but the opponents. It's a clash of giants who all want the rights of the individual to be upheld, but they just have different views of how that would be implemented, again, for a more perfect union. That everyone was seeking this more perfect union between the states. And so if you read some of the things that the Anti-Federalists said, if you read it today, they are spot on some of the abuses. And so I don't want to denigrate their function.
Not at all. Right.
At all. But like you said,
they were mistaken.
We wouldn't have.
Yeah, they're mistaken on this issue.
They're mistaken. And regarding history, you're right, Andy. But guess what? This show, The Hero Show, is a history. What we do every week is we set the context for these heroes that sadly students today do not get in school. But guess what? Have your classmates watch this show. That's fine. If you want American history, come here, because as you said, Andy, we've covered several of the heroes of the Revolutionary era.
We've done Benjamin Franklin also.
Snippets. That's right. That's right.
Franklin, I think, was our second show, and I'm going to mention Franklin, today, even though he's not part of the quartet. But I just want to add Joseph Ellis, who's not just a very knowledgeable American historian. He's a brilliant writer. He just writes so well. Not all historians do. In fact, not all writers do. But Ellis writes so vividly, and his description of the Madison versus Henry confrontation in the Virginia ratification debate is just dramatic, as it should be. Talk about the clash of titans. Those are the two giants, on that issue in the all important arena of Virginia. So we'll definitely discuss it. I love the way Ellis describes it. But first things first. I know you wanted to. Did you want to start with Hamilton and Madison recruiting Washington, or where did you want to start?
Yeah, I want to. Yes, that's a good starting point, Andy. But just backtracking, you made an important point earlier that I didn't confirm. America is a constitutional republic, and it is not a democracy. Even today, it is not a democracy. And Hamilton was, of all of the founders, he was the most against it. So I've written, there are some TOS articles that I've written, Carrie Ann and I, and there's some references that I'll go to today.
The most against democracy, you saying?
Yes. And here's what he says at the New York Ratification Convention. Hamilton says, the ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. And what Hamilton saw by democracy was mob rule. And guess what? That's what we largely have today. So he envisioned this.
That's what it is. I mean, the democracy executed Socrates, right? Basically for philosophizing too effectively, for raising, powerful moral objections against state policy. I just want to say one thing. Yeah, democracy is unlimited majority rule. So it's actually a form of totalitarianism. Because the majority there's no restraints on the will of the majority. If they don't like your political views or your religious views or whatever, they want to execute you for it. They have the political authority to do so. I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think it was Franklin who jocularly described democracy as two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for lunch.
He's attributed to that. Whether he actually said it, that's disputed, but I love that. That's right. Deciding what's for lunch. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The lamb votes for grass, and the two wolves vote for lamb. So lamb's outvoted.
Yes.
He gets eaten. Yeah. So that's a perfect. Whoever said it, sounds like Franklin, but whoever said it is right on. I mean, he's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah. So between Hamilton and Madison, and they know that right now, if they just want to change the Articles of Confederation, this is 1784, 85, 86, they need Washington's buy-in. All right. By this time, Washington has done, as we said in a prior episode, he's gone off back to his farm at Mount Vernon. And King George said if he does that, he's the greatest man alive. And that's where Washington was at this point. But he also saw the
virtuoso. He's the virtuoso of resignation, I think Gary Wills described.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
He was not a power luster.
No.
Right? Washington was not a power luster.
Not only was he not the power luster, but when they envisioned, the framers of the Constitution envisioned the executive branch, okay, they had division of labor between the three branches, division of power, actually, not labor, division of powers. And Washington was the model in mind, and he knew it himself. He was the reluctant leader in many senses. So they recruit him, Madison and Hamilton, I'm sorry. And Washington sees, again, he's reluctant, but he knows that he is the guy. He is the one that everyone looks up to.
Yeah,
if he presides,
right.
No,
right.
Without Washington, there would be no. Yeah,
no credibility,
Exactly.
for this constitutional convention amongst the American
Yes,
people.
that's right. That's exactly right. And if we could, so it's the three of them. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about John Jay as well, because he was part of this. He was part of this scenario, and Jay, his importance. First of all, as a New Yorker, he so the two of the most important states were Virginia and New York. And there was a lot of resistance in both of them. You already mentioned Patrick Henry. Thomas Jefferson was away in Europe at the time, but initially he was not in favor of the Constitution. And in New York, there was a lot of resistance as well.
Yeah,
Clinton, the
George Clinton
that's right.
was he? I know he was a power broker in New York State. Was he the governor? I forget,
Yes,
but he was
yeah,
he was the most powerful politician. He
he
controlled
was
a
absolutely.
huge
That's right.
political machinery, and we'll get to it when we discuss the Federalist, and the ratification debates. But they abused Alexander Hamilton. I mean, in the most horrific
Yes,
terms.
yeah.
So, but we'll get to that, right? We don't want to get ahead of
But
ourselves.
he had an ally in John Jay. So between the three of them,
Right,
or
right.
now if we just refer to them as the quartet, they convince enough people. They get a quorum to say, okay, we have to meet in Philadelphia. And basically, the way they could get that buy-in was to say to make changes to the Articles of Confederation. If they came right out and said, we're going to scrap it, well, it's a total failure, we're going to scrap it, there would not have been buy-in from, but Washington, because he said he would preside. So here's this chance to be a president. The first, he was the president of the convention. And
Right.
as you said, he brought credibility to it. So we move on, and there are these debates that happen throughout the convention. And there's the New Jersey plan, there is the Virginia plan, and
There we go.
yeah, yes.
Great painting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. You can see Washington there. The central figures, if we look at the painting, Washington is standing, proudly, and Franklin is seated, and Hamilton is whispering. I have a theory of what Hamilton is whispering into Franklin's ear, but I'll say that towards the end. Not a theory as much
Well,
as
he
a joke.
probably telling him about some hot girls that he met.
No, it's something about a rising sun. Okay, but
All right.
just to plant the seed here. So these central figures
Well,
are
but
there.
they both had a reputation as something of a ladies' man, though. Hamilton and
Yes,
Franklin
they
both,
did.
right?
They both did. And Ellis has a great description of Hamilton, as he's a man's man and a ladies' man. He could talk your ear off with cigars and brandy about politics in one side, and then entice the ladies in the other room. So that is a good point. So there are different theories of what will happen with this Constitution. Hamilton gets up and speaks for 6 hours straight. And at one point, there's this this idea that comes out of it is, a monarch who will have the position for life, which is that's not an accurate report. But again, he's thinking of an executive, a strong executive to have a power, and then two other branches, legislative and
And the independent judiciary,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So this is what's happening throughout. And then it's also important that they say 9 of the 13 states need to approve of the Constitution. So we're September 17th, 1787. The reason why we're celebrating today is that's the day that it's signed, but it's not yet ratified. And it takes a solid 2 years of back and forth for the ratification to happen.
And some of it brutal political infighting, right? In
Yes.
some cases, maybe especially in New York. But
especially in New York, and Hamilton gets what I have here is a nice bound version of the Federalist Papers, which you and I have talked about, Andy. And I'll just go Federalist number 1. So Hamilton gets this idea to write a series of articles, 85 articles, to convince New Yorkers.
Can we back up just a second?
Yes.
Because that happens after the Constitutional Convention, and I wanted to
go ahead, Andy.
Before we get to the Federalists, I want to read something from the quartet about the convention itself. This is great because Ellis does a great job, Robert and everybody. He's setting the dramatic context. And listen to what he says about Madison here. Then this chapter is aptly named "The Courting," where the other 3 members courted Washington to get his presence and presiding over the convention, like you said. In the course of his campaign to recruit Washington to the cause, he, meaning Madison, had promised that the upcoming convention in Philadelphia would not be satisfied with temporary solutions, an implicit commitment to replace rather than merely revise the articles. That in turn meant an entirely new political framework would be required to replace the current Confederation. Like an assiduous student preparing for a final exam, Madison focused his formidable energies on designing the political architecture for a truly national government that would set the agenda in Philadelphia. His duties as a delegate in the Confederation Congress became abiding irrelevancies. Everything now depended on what happened in Philadelphia. And that, in turn, depended to a great degree on the presence of America's most indispensable character. After some last-minute second thoughts about the wisdom of it all, Washington rode out of Mount Vernon in early May. His very presence certified the significance of the occasion, as did his willingness to risk his reputation in order to rescue the American Revolution from its own excesses. As for what he referred to as a remedy, that was Madison's department. And one would be hard-pressed to find anyone else on the planet with his unique combination of political savvy, psychological intensity, and cerebral power. This would be his finest hour. Mm-hmm. And that's the end of the chapter on the courting, and the next chapter is named Madison's Moment. And yes, we this
awesome.
Yeah, this is good stuff. So there's intense disagreement all across many of the colonies, like you said, and Hamilton spearheads this effort to write. These are largely newspaper editorials. The Federalist is such sophisticated political theory. It really shows the literacy levels of revolutionary America, that these were largely newspaper editorials designed for every man to read. And Hamilton spearheaded it. Right, Publius was actually Hamilton. Yes. Hamilton wrote 51. I think Madison 29 and Jay 5 of these 85 essays. Yeah, Hamilton had an amazing output in a short period of time of brilliant political theory.
While working as a lawyer, while supporting his family as a lawyer, riding a ferry up and down from Albany, which is Schuyler was his father-in-law who had an estate there, coming back to New York City. He recruits. So it's 1 month after the Constitutional Convention, September. In October, there's already anti-Federalist papers coming out, anti-Federalist articles, and Hamilton realizes they need to say what the Constitution is. Give us the nuts and bolts of this, so that the everyman, or as we, for TOS and OSI, we appeal to the intelligent layman. And that's what they were doing. They wanted the intelligent layman to understand. So he sets out the premise for the upcoming 85 articles that'll come out over a short span. And just one quick quote in Federalist number 1. He says, it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So this is brand new. This is different from the European mindset, which is conquest and just filled with bloody wars and that end, and then 5-10 years later restart up again. Hamilton's this again, the age of reason and enlightenment.
To your point, Robert, this is very shortly before the rise of Napoleon, and there's just endless bloody wars that tear apart the European continent for a number of years.
And I do want to, at the end, Andy, I do want to do a quick contrast between American and French revolutions, because we can see that's a laboratory for reason versus force. Exactly what Hamilton is anticipating in this in Federalist Number 1, and he goes on throughout the different. Madison has some fabulous.
It was one of Madison. It was one of Madison's, wasn't it? Where he spoke, where he said, "If men were angels," what was that famous quote that they wouldn't need no government. They wouldn't need government. Mm-hmm. But it says, men aren't angels. The government has to be one. I think he said checked by the power of the people, but also there needs to be built-in. There needs to be built-in restrictions on the power of the government. It's a long time since I read the Federalist. I could be misremembering what Madison said, but I think he was arguing for
that's
restricting government power. Right?
Yeah, that's right. And Hamilton in number 15. This is the last one I'll read from Federalist Papers, but he identifies a fundamental problem, which he calls imperium in imperio, which is a sovereign within a sovereign. Now, again, if we look at America, this is unprecedented in the latter, the fourth quarter of the 18th century. Is individual is sovereign. It's not, the individual is not the subject of the state or the church. So this is completely unprecedented. But within the sovereignty, is he the sovereign of his state or the larger federal society? And this is what Carrie Ann writes. She says, such divided sovereignty leads to the inability to resolve disputes or enforce a resolution in cases of disagreement. And Hamilton's solution was this great and radical vice was to create a national executive and judiciary with the necessary powers to secure the rights of all the citizens, to extend the authority of the Union to the person of the citizens, the only proper objects of government. So again, he's looking for the purpose of government. Hamilton understands is to secure rights. He's seen mob rule. He's seen democracy boil down. He's seen people tarred and feathered. He's seen after the war, he's defending Tories in New York City because their property is still being damaged. And he's like, wait a minute, the war is over and we need to rebuild. So these people have businesses and they've accepted this new society. So you can't destroy them. We need a sanctity of contract and things of that nature. So these are all the points he's fighting for, Andy.
No, absolutely. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when Hamilton was young, right before the war, he was at Columbia, right? A student at Columbia. And there wasn't this mob of patriots who wanted to beat up or kill or tar and feather the president of Columbia, who was a Tory, and Hamilton protected him from this mob, even though he sided.
Miles Cooper.
Hamilton sided in theory with the beliefs of the mob. Mob rule is vicious insanity, and Hamilton, I think if I remember correctly, he protected the life of the president of Columbia,
who escaped through the back door. Yeah, Miles Cooper escaped through the back door to safety. But one good integration there, Andy, it was King's College back then, and Hamilton, the New Yorkers, Hamilton and John Jay decided to change it to Columbia because they wanted to get rid of the British titles, and they changed it to Columbia, which is in honor of Christopher Columbus, who was an upcoming hero we will talk about in October. Just a little planting a seed there.
And as much as we respect the Brits for many things, no kings in this country. We can get away from the reference to kings.
That's right.
But anyway,
the debate continues, Andy.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, so we know the debate continues, and then we realize that, and here's your part about the Virginians don't. There, if 9 of the states ratify, but New York and Virginia do not, there's going to be a problem here. And as it turns out,
Right.
9 of the states do. New Hampshire was the ninth, but New York and Virginia were not yet sold on it. So you take
Yeah,
over,
those are
Andy. What was the thing
two
that got the
major states.
Virginians?
Yeah. I want to read from Ellis on
Go
the
ahead.
magnificent the magnificent debate between Henry and Madison. But first, I think we should mention George Washington's comments on the Federalist, because I think that
Yes.
bears
Yeah.
that bears noting.
Hmm. Hmm.
So let's listen to this. This is Ellis. This is Ellis writing before we get to the quote from Washington. All that said, the Federalist Papers remain an American masterpiece, mostly Hamilton's masterpiece, the classical statement for the viability of a nation sized republic. Washington was remarkably prescient on this score. When Hamilton presented him with a 2 volume edition in August 1788, Washington offered the following opinion. Here's the quote from Washington. I have read every performance which has been printed on one side or the other on the question lately agitated, and regarded the production of your triumvirate as best by far. What a great writer George Washington was. It always struck me.
Yes.
This guy's he's a
Yes.
military guy. He writes beautifully. Listen to this. When the transient circumstances and fugitive performances which attend this crisis shall have disappeared, that work will merit the notice of posterity, because it identified the principles underlying our noble experiment in permanent and classical form. And
Hmm.
Washington was right. It took aside from there's a couple of points. First of all, Washington was right. It took a long time, but the Federalist became ultimately recognized as a brilliant piece of work, largely Hamilton, but also Madison and Jay, on political theory and the underlying principles of a constitutional republic. And again, I wanted to mention Washington was a military guy. Look at the way he wrote. I mean, obviously he's a brilliant guy, but the education back then in the 18th century
Yeah.
was so much better than what it is today. All of these, you read these 18th century people, and they're all so much better writers than than people today, and it really shows. Again, the education was better, and we need to we need to. It's inspiring. The education in this country can be and needs to be at the same level that it was back then, when
Yes.
military men were writing as brilliantly as George and governing as brilliantly as George Washington.
Yeah. And
Uh,
businessmen too, though he was a businessman,
yeah, that's right.
primarily.
That's
he
right.
he was like the reluctant military leader who was the farmer, and but correspondence was a big part of Washington's life. So you're right. He was a beautiful writer, despite not
Absolutely.
having the academic credentials of some of the other founders.
Yeah, what did
So
Ellis
yeah,
Ellis Ellis put it? John Adams went to Harvard, Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary, George Washington went to war.
exactly. Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's a great
So
division of labor, though. Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and so you're right. New York and Virginia become the two major players here that had to be won over. Didn't Hamilton establish like a series of almost Pony Express kind of couriers back and forth between New York and
Between
Virginia
New York
to
and Phil, yeah, New York and Virginia. That's right.
yeah.
That's right. Because he wanted the Virginians to know what was being published, like hot off the presses. He'd have this go to normally, because Hamilton and Madison wanted to not overlap in what they covered, so the ink was still wet, and it would be in the on horseback on its way to Virginia, and then Madison would see that and then write something else, piggybacking, literally piggybacking on that. So
Right,
there's one part
right.
I want to, I just want to bring up that another TOS piece that Richard Salzman talks about here. And here we could bring in, going even further back, he says Hamilton, like most of the Federalists, endorsed the constitutional principle of a mixed, known as mixed government, akin to that advocated by Aristotle, Polybius, and Montesquieu, which held that government is more likely to be both humane and durable if constituted as a balance of elements reflecting monarchy, executive branch, aristocracy, Senate and the judicial branch, and democracy, legislative branch. So these are some. This goes back to antiquity, and Hamilton understood, Aristotle's politics, and he's putting it into practice here. And Richard ends by saying the new Constitution dispersed and decentralized the power across the three branches, including checks and balances to ensure that overall power was limited. Again, that was one of the biggest fears of the Anti-Federalists, was that we just threw off this British king, and now you want to have this monarch
Right.
here, and but the Federalists know that quote monarch is George Washington, is the ideal that they are looking to, especially to be the first executive once the Constitution is ratified.
It's fascinating, isn't it? If you want a leader, of a free country, George Washington's your ideal guy. But if you want a monarch,
Yes.
George Washington's the last guy, because you don't want it.
Yes.
He's not going to be a monarch. But to get back to the Virginia ratification debate, it reads almost like a great novel, because the essence of great fiction is conflict. And we have this conflict of titans. And Ellis points out Patrick Henry's reputation, his bona fides as a revolutionary leader are unassailable, and his reputation as the greatest orator of his age are completely accurate. And he is a formidable opponent. So, reading from the quartet. Everyone realized that the two titans in the Richmond debates were going to be Henry and Madison. To describe Madison as a titan seems incongruous, since he was a diminutive physical presence. Yeah, he was small, he was sickly, right? They used to call him Poor Jemmy because he was like frail and sickly. So he was a diminutive. He lived to be 85, though, as I recall. He was a diminutive physical presence, and on his feet was barely audible, speaking like a stilted professor who kept referring to notes stuffed in his hat, the oratorical opposite of the unscripted, free-floating Henry. Appearances, however, were deceptive. Madison was accustomed to being the most fully prepared speaker in the room, the kind of frustrating opponent who somehow seemed to understand the implications of your argument better than you did. Unlike Henry, he had been present to hear all the debates in Philadelphia, and he possessed the fullest set of notes on those debates. Then the act of drafting 29 essays as Publius had given his thoughts a final gloss. It was, in fact, an equal contest between a great orator and a great thinker. As John Marshall so nicely put it, quote from Marshall, Mr. Henry had without doubt the greatest power to persuade, but Mr. Madison had the greatest power to convince. Unquote from Ellis, quoting John Marshall. Now, that's it. Before we go further with the Virginia debate, that we should examine what does John Marshall mean by that. I mean, I'm guessing that Henry was this dynamic speaker who could integrate, principles with emotional force and really, win you over emotionally. Whereas Madison was dry and dull and was not a powerful speaker. But he was the master of facts, figures, evidence, and he was just an unbeatable lawyer. He appealed to the intellect, to the mind. I think that's what Marshall means when he said Madison was the most convincing.
Yes. And again, let's go to the era, Andy, the age of enlightenment and reason.
Yeah,
so reason held so much sway back then. And although Henry was the most brilliant orator, in my opinion, in American history, I mean, he launched his two famous speeches, kind of launched the revolution in a way it would not have been done. But give me the facts, give me the figures, just the facts, man, as Joe Friday says, right? We repeat that. And that audience, that audience wanted facts. They did not want to appeal to emotions nearly as much. And when the balance of the country was on the line, and the future of the country was on the line. So I think that's
Right.
what that's what Marshall meant by that. Another
Yeah.
brilliant mind who deserves his own hero show, by the way, is
Yeah.
John Marshall. Mhm.
Absolutely. He was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as I
Yes,
recall. Right.
that's right.
But
Hmm.
yeah. Yeah, and it's not Henry's integration of principle with an intense emotion is brilliant. And Henry was a very principled guy, as well as flamboyant in defense of individual rights. I was
Yes.
understandably concerned that a centralized government would violate the rights of American citizens the way the British government did. But Madison showed with facts, figures, evidence that that's not necessarily the case, right? That a large scale, a republic-sized government, just like a state-sized government or a smaller local government, can respect individual rights. And he won the day in the Virginia debate. I think the final ratification vote was very close, but
Yes.
they sided with Madison on this,
Yeah.
which is a great, another one of Madison's great achievements.
Yeah. And they were the 10th state. So again, it was already by number, it was already ratified. New Hampshire was uh, the deciding state, number 9. But then came Virginia, then came New York. And again, if without buy-in from those two major states, there would have been problems. There
Yeah, it would
absolutely
have
would
been
have been
precarious.
problems.
Would have been a
Yeah.
precarious, balance, or
Victory. Yeah.
precarious state for a full size republic without New York and
Yeah.
Virginia, taking part in
Right.
it.
And what was it, Andy, that this is where you are somewhat of an expert on? I could say this. What was it that pulled the Virginians into? What convinced Jefferson, who was across in Europe, that the Constitution would be valid? What needed to be added, so to
Yeah,
speak?
right. Jefferson and Madison were, of course, close friends. And Ellis points out, and, Jefferson, all his flaws, is also a giant. And we did a show on Jefferson. And Jefferson kept nudging, Madison. We need a Bill of Rights. We need a Bill of Rights. We need a Bill of Rights. And did I say we need a Bill of Rights? And I think, and I think Patrick Henry, if I remember correctly, Patrick Henry was assuaged by that, right? That the Bill of Rights
Yeah, that's
added
right.
to the U.S. Now,
Yes.
Madison did it. Madison did at first didn't think it was necessary because the state governments already had laws protecting individual rights, and the U.S. Constitution as a whole he thought was protective of it. But he was won over. Once he was won over, he went into full James Madison mode, and the
Yeah.
Bill of Rights is a brilliant political statement. I love the First Amendment, in particular, which everybody knows as the Freedom of Speech Amendment, but they don't realize it's the freedom of religion. A lot of people don't realize it's the freedom of religion amendment, right? The very first words Madison added was, what was the quote? Congress shall make no laws respecting
No
an
laws.
establishment of religion, or
Yes.
restricting the free exercise thereof,
Thereof.
unquote. What I
Mhm.
like to put Madison and the founders, Robert, they privatized religion. This is really what they
Yeah.
did. They privatized
Yeah.
religion. It's not a matter for the government. It's a matter for each individual to decide on his own. It's a
Hmm.
tremendous step forward in the protection of individual rights. And the Bill of Rights is a brilliant statement. The Second Amendment, of course, also. The Bill of Rights satisfied Jefferson, satisfied anti-ratifiers like Henry, because what it really does is it restricts the power of the federal government. Right, the
Hmm.
federal, individual citizens have the right to, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to peaceful assembly, which does not include, by the way, burning down Portland, Seattle, or Minneapolis, but peaceful, right to peaceful assembly and protest, the right to bear arms, which I think is critical. And
Yes.
it's a brilliant statement, and it legally restricts the power of the powerful federal government, and it's just it's brilliant the way that was done. And Madison kept his word. He said, he promised that in the first Congress that they would add that Bill of Rights, and after the Constitution was ratified, was it 1790? Was that in the first in the first
89.
Congress? So
89. Yes.
the Constitution was ratified in 89, and
Mhm.
the first U.S. Congress was 1790. Madison was in the House, right,
Mhm.
and wrote the Bill of Rights, and in 1790, and it was. I don't even know the mechanics. It must have been ratified by Congress, right? The
Yeah.
Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Mhm.
Was ratified
Mhm.
by the first Congress, and there you go. I mean, for all its flaws, this is the political and underlying moral philosophic framework of the greatest nation in world history.
That's right. And so, who would be the first executive? Now how
Oh
does
yeah,
the country
yeah,
start?
yeah, that's a tough question to answer.
And one of my favorite quotes: "The Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon." George Washington. So he took it seriously. When he put his hand on the Bible, downtown New York City, which was the capital at that time for a short period, uh, he meant it. The Constitution is the law of the land. To this day, despite all of the uh, you know lack of implementation that we see today, but Washington was the guy, that he was the person that they had in mind to get the country off the ground. This was a necessary culmination. And then if we go back to the painting, this is why Washington is the central figure. Your eye goes right to him,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I like to think of it. Ben Franklin says at the end, I was wondering whether that is a rising or a setting sun, but now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. And I think
yeah.
Hamilton's, whispering to him, yeah, that is right. And
Right.
one
But
other point, Andy, real fast. Go ahead.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, there were two
I was
things
going to
I
say.
wanted to
Let me just add one
go
last
ahead.
point.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
distinguishing the Declaration from the Constitution. Declaration, Ayn Rand herself called it the most beautiful, political document ever written. But there are references there to divine providence, and nature's God, and the Constitution has none of those. Okay, and they asked Hamilton, why is there no mention of God in the Constitution? Hamilton says, we forgot. But guess what? Hamilton never forgot
That's
anything.
funny.
So that was on purpose. And that's
You
why the
forgot.
Constitution
That's
is
funny.
dear to my heart. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Andy. You had a
That's
couple of
very
points.
funny. Yeah, it's very funny. I didn't even know that. That's hilarious. But there was just two things I wanted to say. I think as I understand it, again, I could be wrong, but the two uh, promises that satisfied the anti-ratifiers. One was that there would be a Bill of Rights restricting the power of the state, and the other was just the tacit understanding that George Washington would be the first president. And I mean,
Yes.
and he was the man. Everybody trusted him, whether whether they agreed or disagreed with various principles of his. They knew his character was just as strong as could be, and he was not going to be a dictator. He was not going to be a monarch. He would not abuse the power of the federal authority. So Washington's personal integrity and his lack of power lust, his concern for respect for individual rights, I think was part of the reason that the Constitution was ratified. And the other point I wanted to make was we got to quote Benjamin Franklin. What he said at the end of the Constitutional Convention, because Franklin is in his 80s at this point, right? He's suffering
Mhm.
from gout and various physical
Yeah.
ailments. He's got to be carried in. He's got to be
They have to carry him
carrying,
in. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
his gate to the convention. His remarks were read by one of his buddies, but he said there was here from Ellis about Franklin. There was an unspoken consensus that he was the wisest man in the room. And I just have to interject here, Rob, and everybody. It's unbelievable the array of talent, the
Yes.
genius in revolutionary America with a tiny population. I don't even know what the free population of the states was, like 2 million or something like this, somewhere
Yeah.
in that range. It was
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
small, and
Yes.
just the collection of genius in so many different arenas. I mean, Franklin was an amazing Renaissance man. I think you can make a case he's the greatest American of history. When John Hersey and I discussed that in the Hero Show on
Hmm.
Franklin. But all right, so unspoken consensus: he was the wisest man in the room. He lived up to that reputation on the last day of the convention with remarks, again delivered by James Wilson, that were both elegantly pragmatic and politically profound. Quote from Franklin: I confess that I do not entirely approve this Constitution at present, but, sir, I am not sure I shall never approve it. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded, like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and I am not sure that it is not the best. Unquote, from Benjamin Franklin. And again, as an aside, I just want to marvel at the writing. This is like a note, Franklin wrote. The writing is
Yeah.
so clear, so effective, and you can see what you admire about Franklin is the honesty of it. The Constitution is flawed. Can we do better? I don't think so. I'm astonished how near to perfection it approaches, and and Franklin signs off on this, that this is the best Constitution that can be provided for us, and he's right.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
nice epitaph. It's a nice epitaph or final word on the status, and the moral stature of the Constitution and its founders, the quartet and all the other American founders, who were clearly concerned about protecting individual rights.
Exactly, Andy. Great point. So let me switch over to another brilliant writer about the Constitution. This is from Censorship Local and Express. Ayn Rand says,
Ayn
ours
Rand.
was the first, right, ours was the first government based on and strictly limited by a written document, the Constitution, which specifically forbids it to violate individual rights or to act on whim. The history of the atrocities perpetrated by all the other kinds of governments, unrestricted governments acting on unprovable assumptions, demonstrates the value and validity of the original political theory on which this country was based. I mean, this is one reason Ayn Rand says America is the only noble country in its original principles, the only moral country in history. So that's one that I have a couple more, Andy, but if you want to jump in on anything, feel
Yeah, I
free.
just want to we should always mention the horrors of slavery, but which was
Yes.
the full
Yes.
context. Of course, it's a slavery was and unfortunately what was a worldwide phenomenon going back far into prehistory. Thomas Sowell makes this point, and so Orlando Patterson, one of the leading experts on slavery, make this point. Uh, and not an accident. America was founded by British colonists, and they had that heritage, that Lockean heritage, the burgeoning principle of the rights of the individual, unalienable rights, as John Locke wrote in the Second Treatise of Civil Government. And the Brits, of course, launched the first abolitionist movement that we know of in history. We did a Hero Show episode on Wilberforce, who He was
Yep.
very flawed as a clergyman. I think he had some Society for the Suppression of Vice or something that Wilberforce was part of, maybe even headed. But he was an ardent abolitionist, and we should point out the principle of individual. It's not an accident. Abolitionism occurs in Britain, and then slavery is all over the world, but abolitionism as a movement originates in Britain, and then is picked up by British colonists in America. Without the principle of individual rights, there's no abolitionist movement. I mean, why is it evil to enslave a human being? Because he got a right to his own life. Abolitionism and capitalism, the political system of individual rights, are intellectual moral brothers, or intellectual moral siblings. And that needs to be pointed out. The principle of individual rights established the freest country in history and ultimately abolished slavery. And in parts of the world where there's no heritage or recognition of individual rights, every communist country, the Nazis, Islamic countries where it's considered fine to enslave infidels or non-religionists, where there's a heritage of individual rights, you find abolitionism. Where there's no heritage of individual rights, there's no abolitionism. And that needs to be pointed out.
Yeah. And Andy, great point. How long did Britain exist before they abolished slavery? For centuries.
Long,
okay?
Oh, yeah.
So America, to think, again, let's drop the context, to think that America could have been founded. And Hamilton wanted this. He started the New York Manumission Society and to abolish slavery in New York in 1785. So before the Constitution, he wanted it to be abolished, but it was.
Yeah,
it
was
Benjamin Franklin.
Soon. Benjamin Franklin headed the Pennsylvania abolition movement.
Right. It was just too soon. So it drops the context of the Southern, the Southern context, that it was steeped for a couple of, more than a century and a half. But they knew, again, let's come back to the preamble. A more perfect union would be without slavery. This is what they were striving for. But again, if we come to today's, context dropping people who blame the founders for not eliminating slavery or endorsing it,
there couldn't be
a
republic.
I completely reject it.
There could not be a republic if the abolitionists had insisted on ending slavery. Even Jefferson, who was a slave owner, they favored the gradual emancipation of slaves, and he saw that the slavery issue, and Jefferson wrote on this, the slavery issue was going to tear the republic apart. They would never been able to found the republic if they insisted on it, and in time it was going to tear the republic apart. And he was prescient on this issue. Jefferson died, what was it, 1826, I think, and 35 years later, the Civil War does exactly that. It threatens. It does tear the republic apart, and it's Lincoln's policies that enable it to be, the republic, the Union, to be preserved. But the Virginians, the important Virginians, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, the most important ones. One were slave owners, but two were abolitionists who all favored the ultimate emancipation of slaves. But it could not have been done. It was barely possible in the 1860s. It was not possible in the 1780s or 1790s when you didn't even have a union yet.
Right, and Jefferson has one of the greatest quotes. It's like having the wolf, by the ears. You don't know whether to let it go or to shackle it, so to speak. So that was the conflict. That was the major conflict. And I could just say, I think some founders were more advanced, more enlightened, talking the Enlightenment era, on this topic. But it abolished slavery, no country. It's just it's that simple. Right. It would not have passed as much as we wanted.
There might have been two countries.
That's right. That's right. Actually, and there were. There were in the Civil War. There were two countries. The Confederated States of America. So going back to Ayn Rand, there's another point we have not yet talked about, but this is one of her criticisms of the Constitution. Again, from Censorship, Local and Express. She says the clause giving Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce is one of the major errors in the Constitution. That clause, more than any other, was the crack in the Constitution's foundation. The entering wedge of statism, which permitted the gradual establishment of the welfare state. But I would venture to say that the framers of the Constitution could not have conceived of what that clause has now become. This is the important part that for me. If in writing, one of their goals was to facilitate the flow of trade and to prevent the establishment of trade barriers among the states, that clause has reached the opposite destination. And actually, I think what she just said, the last part, is what the intention was. Because if we look at regulation, to be regular is free flowing. So I think actually in the Constitution, that regulation term means there should be a free flow of trade. But nowadays, it's 180 degrees different. Regulation means, strangulation and setting up barriers. But I like that Rand puts that in there as an if. She's saying what she thinks is one of the major errors, but she's saying if this is what they meant, we are now at the opposite. Why? Because philosophy is more important than politics. And philosophy, sadly. Go ahead, Andy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, somehow I don't think James Madison, the other founders, would endorse Bernie Sanders. No.
No,
I don't think so.
But Hamilton, I think this is Hamiltonian because Hamilton wanted commerce. He saw between New York and New Jersey, and we'll talk eventually about about Vanderbilt and how he straddled those two in favor of free trade. But Hamilton saw that the states need to be there needs to be commerce between the states, this free flowing, regular point there.
I think that's true. Right, New Jersey must be free. Right, that was the flag that Vanderbilt flew on his boat. We'll discuss that when we get to Vanderbilt.
When we get to him, the first tycoon.
You're right, but the last point I want to make is it's brilliant in Atlas Shrugged when Judge Narragansett, near the end of the story, is editing an ancient document and adds the clause that Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of production and trade, and that's the Constitution is brilliant. It's imperfect. It's brilliant, and Judge Narragansett's clause, here's another element for the Bill of Rights, is definitely needed. Definitely needed. It captures the spirit of the Constitution, the protection, the application of the principle of individual rights into the economic sphere.
That's right. That's right. And one last one from Rand. She says, if a drought strikes them, animals perish. Man builds irrigation canals. If a flood strikes them, animals perish. Man builds dams. If a carnivorous pack attacks them, animals perish. Man writes the Constitution of the United States.
It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I just love the way she captures that. I mean, it's just fabulous. So my final point, Andy, is the Declaration, declaring independence and winning a war were necessary, but not sufficient for the American Revolution or Second Revolution to be successful. You needed the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, Bill of Rights, all of those things that we're celebrating today to be why this, again, sometimes, Andy, when we do hero shows, we can say we might have been here if this hero didn't exist. We can't say that about today's show. We would not have been here if these people did not do what they did.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, our families, for both of us, and so many others, were immigrant families who escaped persecution, whether it was in Ireland or Eastern Europe or whatever, and fled to America to seek freedom. And then that was, you're right, that was guaranteed by James Madison and the quartet. So I think and Ayn Rand, of course, also an immigrant.
Yes,
I don't think. Of course, she's a genius. She's a literary and philosophic genius, extraordinarily so. But again, I don't think it's an accident that it took an immigrant to fully appreciate the brilliant significance of the American U.S. Constitution. And
Yeah.
and I agree with Joseph Ellis. So after reading the quartet, there's two aspects to the American Revolution. There's winning the War of Independence, and then there's the Second American Revolution of setting up a republic, a free republic, not a collection of free states.
Right. Yep.
Well, I
Oh, one
think,
last thing. And actually,
yeah.
no, I'm sorry.
Go
One
ahead. Go
last
ahead.
thing. So you and I,
Go ahead.
if you remember, we were at a Constitution event
Oh yeah, yeah.
back in 2014. I actually found this going through my stuff. Support the Constitution, September of 2014. You gave a talk. I was the MC of the event.
Right.
And on a personal note, that was the first time I set eyes on my sweetheart, Carrie Ann Biondi.
Ah,
So that was
nice.
personally important to me. But you and I celebrated a Constitution event. I just wanted to.
Yeah.
We go back celebrating this document. Okay.
Right. Right. I spoke on the right to bear arms, as I recall.
That's right.
That-
Yes, you did. Mm-hmm.
yeah. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's an important right not only to defend us against criminals, but as the U.S. government moves more and more
Yeah.
towards dictatorship, unfortunately, sadly, and terrifyingly, it may turn out to be a super important right. But I'll just leave it at that. Hopefully, the trend towards dictatorship in this country can be resolved peacefully.
Yes, and upholding the Constitution is the means towards that end. And so that's why today's history lesson for you students of history, whether you're in government schools or private schools, is the validity and the heroism of the Constitution.
Absolutely. And so I want to salute the quartet and their supporters and the writers and ratifiers of the U.S. Constitution. I want to wish you, Robert, and everybody out there in Hero Land, have a heroic day. And of course, for all of us, we strive to lead a more thank you. We strive to lead a more heroic life. And we will see you next week on the Hero Show, everybody.
Sweet oil.